On July 18, 2022, a small group of protesters gathered outside the Charleston offices of West Virginia U.S. Senator Joe Manchin. They were outraged at Senator Manchin's refusal to support a budget reconciliation bill that included tax, energy, and climate provisions, all key pieces of the Biden administration's legislative agenda.
We need good jobs. That's exactly what the clean energy investments in the reconciliation bill would have done. Brought thousands of good-paying union jobs to West Virginia. Lowered energy costs. And made West Virginia a leader in the energy industry like we always have. Instead, Senator Manchin chose his pocketbook over the needs of his constituents once again.
Pass climate now! Pass climate now! Pass climate now!
Manchin's opposition to important pieces of the Biden agenda isn't really anything new. Manchin is a conservative Democrat from a deeply red state, a state that Donald Trump won twice by large margins. In an evenly divided Senate, that's made Joe Manchin the deciding vote on many highly consequential pieces of legislation, and one of the most powerful people in Washington. Manchin's been in the national spotlight for his refusal to support legislation such as Build Back Better, the codification of Roe v. Wade, and almost every green energy or climate change initiative. That has placed him squarely in the crosshairs of progressive Democrats across the country. But a surprise agreement changed everything.
Good morning. So U.S. Senator Joe Manchin and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer have announced they have reached an agreement on legislation addressing climate change, healthcare costs, and deficit reduction.
We need more energy today, and we also need to invest in the energy for the future.
A lot of Democrats who used to be very angry at you are suddenly now saying nice things about you.
This is a balanced approach that everyone's been talking about.
What they see is a senator who they thought was moderate.
I know people who don't like the president, don't like Democrats, might be upset.
Do we think he was laying in wait the whole time just so he could appear like a hero?
Yes. Absolutely.
Manchin's unexpected reversal of position resulted in the Inflation Reduction Act. It's an historic and sweeping piece of legislation. There are major investments in both green energy and fossil fuel development, climate change initiatives, a major overhaul of corporate taxes, and caps on out-of-pocket prescription drug spending. The deal left politicians, pundits, and everyday voters on both sides of the aisle who thought that they had Manchin figured out, wondering, well, wait a minute. So then who is Joe Manchin? From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, you're listening to Us and Them, the show about the issues that divide us. I'm Trey Kay. As many listeners know, I split my time between West Virginia, where I was born and raised, and New York, where I began my career in radio. In the past few years, Senator Joe Manchin has become a hot topic in both places. My progressive friends in New York and in other parts of the country are well aware that I'm a West Virginia native, so I have become their unofficial Joe Manchin answer desk. People text me, email me, leave me voice messages, and even buttonhole me at parties to share their feelings about Joe Manchin. Some people want to tell me how much they respect him. And others want to say, what the hell is wrong with Joe Manchin?
Hey, Trey, it's here, just calling to make a comment about our Senator Manchin.
He's not really a Democrat. I think he's a dino.
It's really, really frustrating.
A Democrat in name only.
I love Joe Manchin.
He owns a coal company.
He's against democracy.
And yet he's the chair of the Energy Committee in Congress?
When I hear the name Joe Manchin, I don't think about D.C. politics.
He's the best ally the Republicans have.
I think about a West Virginian who represents the interests of the people.
And then he also is blocking the filibuster.
Joe Manchin, in my opinion, is a much-needed moderate voice.
He's just making it impossible for the Democrats to do their business.
If he went for president, I would vote for him, and I'm a lifelong Republican.
Eventually, it occurred to me. Joe Manchin is one of the most polarizing figures in current American politics. He embodies the great national divide between us and them. And yet, Senator Joe Manchin has never been the focus of our work on this show. Until now. When it comes to West Virginia politics, and certainly when it comes to chronicling Joe Manchin's career, there is really only one place to start.
My name is Hoppy Kercheval, and I work for West Virginia Metro News, the statewide radio network in West Virginia.
Hoppy Kercheval began his career in West Virginia journalism in the late 1970s. He's known statewide as host of Talkline. It's a daily talk show that began back in 1993. Throughout his political career, Senator Joe Manchin has been a regular guest on Talkline. I asked Hoppy Kercheval to give us a nutshell summary of Joe Manchin's political resume.
Joe Manchin's from Marion County, and he has been in politics all his adult life. He started out in the West Virginia House of Delegates probably 40 years ago, and from there went to the West Virginia State Senate. From there, Secretary of State. From there, he had an unsuccessful run for the Democratic nomination for governor when he lost to Charlotte Pritt. But then he subsequently won in the next election and served about a term and a half as governor and then resigned from his second term and was appointed to the U.S. Senate and then was elected to the U.S. Senate when he defeated Patrick Morrisey. So he has this entire life in West Virginia politics. He comes from a rather prominent Marion County family. His family, the Manchins, were successful entrepreneurs, and he had a famous uncle, A. James Manchin, who was Secretary of State and later State Treasurer. So the Manchins have always been at the forefront, not only in politics, but in business in West Virginia. So it's just a family that has always been involved and very visible in West Virginia.
As Joe Manchin has come up through the political ranks, West Virginia has made a profound transformation from a deep blue state to a deep red state. But from the beginning, Manchin positioned himself well to the right of his fellow Democrats.
To my knowledge, he's always been a Democrat. And when he first got into politics, everybody was a Democrat in West Virginia. I mean, 40 years ago, 2/3 of all the registered voters in West Virginia were Democrats. I mean, there just weren't any Republicans. There weren't any Republicans in the Congress from West Virginia or the Senate. But West Virginia was dominated by Democratic politics, and Manchin was a Democrat. However, when the Democrats were dominant in West Virginia, there were always a couple of factions. There was a liberal wing, there was a sort of moderate Democratic wing, and there was a conservative pro-business wing. And Manchin was always in that conservative to moderate arena. He was never a liberal Democrat per se.
Most people are understandably confused by Manchin's seemingly inconsistent positions. He votes with the conservatives on one day and then the liberals on the next. However, Kercheval understands that putting a party label on Manchin just doesn't work.
The macro about Manchin is, it is less about party politics and more just about what Joe Manchin is trying to do as Joe Manchin. And I always say, when I'm asked, I say, well, he belongs to the party of Joe Manchin. He's Joe Manchin. He's this populist. And as a populist, I think he's constantly taking the pulse of the constituents and thinking out loud lots of times, sort of testing things and seeing where they are and having this ongoing poll or survey, if you will, that occurs, I think, with him in his mind and publicly. And that's how he maneuvers. I see him operating that way. Not like, well, here's a Democratic idea. I need to push a Democratic idea. Here's a Republican idea. It's more like what makes sense to him. So with Manchin, you always have to consider first and second and third the individual, much more so than party affiliation.
Hoppy Kercheval's observations of Manchin's political tactics can help explain Manchin's consistently high stature despite the state's political shifts.
West Virginia is a conservative state, a state that Donald Trump won by 40-plus points twice, where Manchin stood up to the quote-unquote Biden Democratic agenda on, for example, the Build Back Better bill. So now he's seen as this individual who is reflecting West Virginian viewpoints and the anti-Biden viewpoint in West Virginia of being this bulwark against Biden and the liberal Democrats. Now, of course, that doesn't do him any favor with the liberal Democrats in West Virginia, of which there are some, but it certainly raises his stature among conservative West Virginians, conservative Democrats, Republicans who say, oh, well, Manchin is standing up against Biden and the Democratic agenda. And that has raised his stature in the state significantly.
Despite Manchin's stature in West Virginia, there are many, both on the far left and on the far right, who would like to see someone else in his U.S. Senate seat. They view Manchin as vulnerable in the current political climate.
Manchin would be a heavy lift for any Republican, but you have to look at the overwhelming numbers now of Republicans and how this is now a deep red state. And Manchin is sort of the last man standing of the Democratic Party in West Virginia. The rest of the delegation is Republican. The state legislature is Republican dominated. The whole Board of Public Works and the governor are Republican. So Manchin's the last guy standing, and I don't know, but I would think that the National Republican Party is going to look at 2024 and think that Manchin is vulnerable. Manchin won against a Republican in 2018, and Manchin has won every election except one, which was a primary. So would he be vulnerable? Yes, but it'd still be very difficult to take him out. You know, Republicans, national Republicans would pour money into it because they could say, okay, we can get a seat here. But you would think national Democrats, even if they're not crazy about Manchin, he's still a Democrat, so they would pour money in it too. I mean, you could imagine just millions and millions of dollars being spent on the race.
Given his tendency to block progressive initiatives, there are certainly some Democrats on the national level who would find it hard to support Joe Manchin's reelection in 2024. But to those Democrats, the ones who say, what the hell is wrong with Joe Manchin? Kercheval has a clear message.
What's wrong with Joe Manchin? Maybe the response is, look in the mirror. You know, what's wrong with your approach? Because you know what? Your approach, and you may feel very pure about it, and you may feel very committed to it, but you're losing. You're going to get whacked in the midterms. Inflation is a problem. So you better look in the mirror and think about your ideological purity and whether you can sacrifice some of that for trying to get some wins as opposed to, swinging for the fences, because you're not going to make it.
Many political pundits say Manchin will have a challenge reclaiming his Senate seat in 2024. While everyone has political opinions, the truth is very few people really have deep insight into how elections are won or lost.
I'm Mike Plant. I'm a Democratic political consultant living in West Virginia and working out of West Virginia.
Mike Plant just happens to be one of those rare people who deeply understands electoral politics, particularly when it comes to Joe Manchin and West Virginia.
My relationship started with Senator Manchin in '96 when I ran the only successful campaign to beat him in the Democratic primary for governor that year. I ran Charlotte Britt's campaign. And a few years later, when he wanted to run for governor, he came and talked to me and wanted me to be part of his team. And so I helped him on his first successful governor's race in 2004. Since that time, I've worked with him in various ways. I helped with communications while he was governor for the state party. And in 2018, I helped run a super PAC to help reelect him.
Mike Plant's unique access to Manchin through the years has made him very familiar with the senator's guiding principles. That knowledge helps him understand why Manchin occasionally takes a position which may be contrary to his party's agenda.
I've been interviewed by the New York Times and the Post and The Hill and a bunch of other different publications because everybody is trying to figure out Joe Manchin. And the thing I always go back to is, he's the same guy he was. He really is. He didn't wet his finger and stick it up in the political prevailing winds and say, okay, this is what I'm going to be now. He's always been this guy. The Joe Manchin we have today is the Joe Manchin you had in 1996. He was a conservative, centrist Democrat. The difference being in 1996, the state, particularly the Democratic Party, was bluer, more progressive, more labor-oriented. And so at that time, Joe's political brand was sort of out of step for a statewide Democratic primary audience.
Being out of step with his party may have been a problem for Manchin at the beginning of his political career, but ever since his rise to the United States Senate, it's become the secret of his success.
From the 2018 race, I know one of the key attributes that people liked about him is that they viewed him as being independent, that he would take on the leadership of his own party when he disagreed with them. And for any candidate to be successful in West Virginia, any Democratic candidate be successful in West Virginia, they have to have cross-party appeal. And Joe Manchin has that in spades. Again, it can be frustrating to progressives, and I understand that. But a big part of what contributes to his popularity in West Virginia is his willingness to stand up to Joe Biden in the White House.
Manchin has, almost single-handedly, held up more than one major piece of legislation in Congress. But Plant is quick to point out that Manchin doesn't make knee-jerk decisions on the issues that are in front of him.
Joe, I think he takes each issue by issue what he's going to do. He voted for Justice Jackson's confirmation. He's voted for the infrastructure bill. He's done these other things. So it's not simply if something is sponsored by and pushed by Joe Biden, it's not that he's going to vote against it, but the fact that he's willing to vote against things that are driven by the leadership of his own party when he thinks they're wrong helps give him his bona fides as somebody who's not just somebody who talks about being independent, but somebody who really is.
At the end of the day, Mike Plant is a strategist. He's a pragmatist who is paid to help political candidates win elections. So when it comes to the question of who progressives should support in the next election, his analysis is crystal clear.
And in West Virginia, independents tend to vote more conservatively than they do progressively. In other words, they tend to vote for more Republicans than Democrats. So you have to have somebody who can appeal to those folks to win. Our Democratic base, sadly, in West Virginia now is about 33%. So to win statewide, it's simple math. It's just a simple math equation. You have to win, consolidate the Democratic base, and win a certain percentage of Republicans and independents. And if you don't do that, you don't win. So I think to my progressive friends in the party, say, you may not like him on certain things, but he's going to be better than any Republican that's elected there because he's still voting for a Democratic majority leader in the U.S. Senate. And as we have now, Democrats are in control of the Senate, and by virtue of that fact, we have Justice Jackson. We control, to some extent, the legislative calendar. We control who's on the committees. We have an immense power because of the fact that Democrats control the Senate, and we can stop a lot of bad stuff. So if you defeat Joe Manchin, be careful of what you wish for, because I think Joe Manchin will be the last statewide Democrat elected in West Virginia for a long time. I don't like that fact, but I think having worked in so many states and seen this happen, you're not going to see a progressive beat Joe Manchin in a primary and then go on to win a general election.
Now, it's one thing to hear political insiders talk about Manchin's cross-party appeal and election dynamics. But if you want the real scoop, you got to speak directly to the voters. As Mike Plant points out, it's just simple math. For Manchin to get reelected in West Virginia, he needs the votes of a significant number of registered Republicans.
My name is Robert White. I'm semi-retired. I was in the military for 20 years, and I was in the oil and gas business for about 10 after that. I live in Charleston, West Virginia, and I vote mainly Republican.
Although he's currently a registered Republican, Robert White is one of a large number of West Virginians who were once members of the state's Democratic Party. Robert and I have known each other for decades, and while his party affiliation may have changed, his support for Joe Manchin has not.
There was a time from when I was 18 until probably 50 that I was a registered Democrat. And then the party walked away from me. And so, I decided to walk away from them as well.
So that's something I've heard before. Like people say, I didn't leave the party left me.
Exactly. And I would even say with the modern day Democratic Party, they've kind of left Joe Manchin and the things that he stood for and believed in. And the reason that I continue to support Joe Manchin is he cares sincerely and deeply about the state of West Virginia. He's not afraid to say he loves his country. I think that the Democratic Party, if it would get back to not being afraid to make the far left mad by saying how much they love America, and that America is the greatest country in the world, and God bless America. I think these things are heartfelt by Americans, and they bring pride and joy to Americans' heart to hear and say them. I think when you take that away and are constantly bickering about America is this, America is that, we're getting tired of hearing that, and we want to hear something good about our country. And I think Democrats have left that completely out of their playbook. And it's because of the Democratic Party selling out to the left and not remembering their base. They used to care about people. They used to be the working man's party. They used to be for the common American. And I think they've allowed Republicans to steal those voters.
If he ran as a Republican, would you vote for him?
Yes, but I don't think he will. I think he's a Democrat. I think he's a West Virginia Democrat. And I think he's the last of a dying breed of the real West Virginia Democrats. I don't feel the same about a lot of Republicans as I do Joe Manchin. I don't agree with everything he says and does, but I do agree with the fact that whatever it is, he believes it in his heart and he thinks it's best for the state of West Virginia. He's one of the last real true Democrats of West Virginia. West Virginia are different Democrats. They are very patriotic. They love the state. They love the country. They are true blue working man politicians, but they all went away. They all went away with a big progressive push to the left, and it pretty much cleared them out of office. And that's amazing to me because seems to me only a few short years ago, Democrats ran the state, and it was really an event if a Republican were to advance in the state of West Virginia.
Seasoned political observers will tell you that elections are all about animal instincts. People tend to vote from their gut and not their head. And that's where Joe Manchin always seems to have an edge on the competition. He connects with voters in a way that can't be explained by polling or surveys.
I keep noticing as we're talking here, you don't say Senator Manchin, you keep referring to him by his first name. Why is that?
That's kind of like his campaigns. It doesn't say tell Senator Manchin this, or it doesn't say tell Senator Manchin that. It says tell Joe. And when he speaks in a way that is like a Joe. It's not like Senator Manchin. He speaks just straight to you. I mean, straight to your heart. I think that he has just naturally become someone who knows how the folks back home think. The folks back home, what would they think about this? What would they think about that? And I believe he acts on that. And I believe that was a saving grace in the last election where they really wanted to take him out. And I'm so glad they didn't. I'm so glad that he won. And yes, I'd vote for him again.
After a break, we'll hear from two political observers who have carefully considered Joe Manchin's future.
If he has a future in politics, it's not going to be running statewide in West Virginia.
The strange fact is Joe Manchin might be unelectable in West Virginia next time around, but he might be electable in the United States.
You're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, and the CRC Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
Hey there, it's Trey, and from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, you're listening to Us and Them. Joe Manchin will not be up for re-election this November, but the outcome of the midterm elections could have a significant impact on him. If Democrats lose their majority in the Senate, Manchin will no longer be the all-powerful deciding vote. If Democrats hold the Senate but lose the House, Democratic legislation would be unlikely to even make it to President Biden's desk. All of this has political observers wondering what the future holds for Joe Manchin. Of course, the person best prepared to answer that question is Joe Manchin himself. However, over the past year, the senator has declined our numerous interview requests. Fortunately, we were able to reach two individuals who have been closely tracking Senator Manchin with an eye toward the future.
I'm Christopher Regan. I'm a retired attorney, a writer, and commentator living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Chris Regan writes for publications such as the Charleston Gazette-Mail and The Atlantic, and he's a former vice chair of the West Virginia Democratic Party. Recently, Regan wrote a widely discussed piece for the Gazette-Mail that suggested Manchin's re-election in 2024 looked questionable. He said the electoral math just wasn't there for the two-term senator. Regan predicted the senator would most likely retire. However, the Inflation Reduction Act has drastically altered Manchin's political landscape.
It had been clear to me for a long time that something had to pass in terms of reconciliation for Manchin to get things that he wanted. Because if no reconciliation bill passed, he would lose out on things that he wanted, such as the oil and gas concessions he got in the Inflation Reduction Act.
The Inflation Reduction Act gave new political life to the faltering Democratic agenda. But Regan points out that it was not all that progressives hoped for.
Politically, it's been a godsend for the Biden administration and the Democrats leading into the midterms because they had just really nothing but negative coverage and things going on for a long time. And this was like a bolt from the blue that, hey, we got something great done. The negatives that I see that can't be forgotten are the things that got omitted from this bill, like adding dental and vision to Medicare and the child tax credit not being extended. But I mean, overall, you've got to take something instead of nothing.
Regan says the landmark legislation has restored Manchin's reputation within the Democratic Party. But is it enough to prevail in a 2024 re-election campaign?
It's gotten him back into somewhat of the good graces of his colleagues in D.C., somewhat of the good graces, I think, of the Biden administration. It's developed some hostility from the Republicans, who at least purported to be taken aback and shocked by what he's done. But I don't think it changes the ultimate calculus that I have evaluated for him, that he's not going to be running again in 2024. The state is now, plus 20, plus 30 for Trump. Registration from Democrat and Republican side is going the wrong way. And, he still has significant losses, I think, among the most progressive Democrats, who are upset with him about his Supreme Court votes during the Trump administration, about losing things like the child tax credit, about him not breaking the filibuster to pass voting rights. I think that could cost him with progressive voters and with African-American voters. There's not a huge African-American voting population in West Virginia, but he doesn't have a big margin. He may have gotten back some of his old Democratic support, who were like, well, gosh, at least Manchin gave us something. It's good to have him there. But I think we still have significant data points that point to that being a hopeless situation and one that therefore he won't enter into.
Simply put, Regan sees Trump's influence in West Virginia as too great to overcome.
The average voter in Trump counties in West Virginia is watching Fox and watching One America News and their coverage of that act. And what does their coverage say? Their coverage says, oh, Manchin has gone back on his word. Manchin has signed on to the big Democrat spending bill. I mean, that's what they call it, the big Democrat spending bill, every time. Now, it doesn't matter that bill is a fraction of what Build Back Better was originally. That's how it's covered there. And so I think that's how it's likely to be perceived by those voters. So I don't think he's winning friends in those counties. I strongly believe that the most likely person to be elected U.S. Senator in 2024 from West Virginia will be a person who says that Trump won in 2020 and should be president right now. And that's the kind of candidate who's going to win West Virginia. Manchin can't get there. He can't become a hard enough Republican to satisfy an electorate that is going to be looking for somebody like that. States that are that hardcore for Trump are not going to elect even a squishy Republican, let alone a Democrat.
When Regan first assessed Manchin's reelection chances, he figured lobbying was in the senator's future. However, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act has created new opportunities for Manchin.
I thought he might go straight into lobbying and straight to K Street. I suppose it's possible that he comes back and he makes this deal with Biden, keeping an eye on some kind of centrist presidential ticket. I mean, that maybe this leaves that out there where he's not so much trying to satisfy the West Virginia voter, but he's trying to say, I'm a compromised national figure. I'm much more conservative than Biden, but I'm much less conservative or crazy than Trump. And so, I belong as a VP, or maybe even this is my shot to take a shot at a presidential run. I think that's out there. It's basically a centrist move. I mean, he's saying I'm in the middle. I can work with everybody. I'm not far out there on the right hand, but I'm not in the pocket of Joe Biden saying Medicare for all and open borders and things like that. So it positions him that way. But if he has a future in politics, it's not going to be running statewide in West Virginia. It's going to be running somewhere else.
When it comes to Manchin's chances on the national stage, Regan believes his greatest challenge lies within his own party.
He's not polarizing anything like the people who are winning in the Republican Party. And he's clearly about as moderate or as center as you get within the Democratic Party. But I don't think the Democratic Party will choose that. You imagine a Democratic primary debate. He voted for Kavanaugh, he voted for Gorsuch. These are the guys who, formed the majority to take away Roe versus Wade. That's real tough stuff in a Democratic presidential primary debate. How can we trust you to appoint to the Supreme Court when you voted for these guys who stuck the biggest knife in us we've ever had? He's a much more plausible general election candidate from the Democratic side than he is a primary candidate. I mean, he would have to say, listen, you're going to lose, period. With any of these other people, you have to go with me to get the Democratic primary voters to think strategically and think, well, we're just going to have to swallow it with Manchin because if we nominate, Senator Moonbeam or Jerry Brown or somebody who's thought of like those guys, we're going down McGovern style.
Regan's reference to George McGovern is an important one. In the 1972 presidential election, McGovern lost 49 states to give Richard Nixon a second term in office. It also left a permanent scar on the Democratic Party. McGovern was a true progressive. However, he had no pull with voters in the middle and zero cross-party appeal. Since his defeat, Democrats have been caught in a never-ending debate over political purity versus electability. Evan Osnos is a writer for The New Yorker who follows West Virginia politics closely. He's interviewed Joe Manchin on numerous occasions and has a deep connection to the Mountain State. His first job out of college was working for the Clarksburg Exponent Telegram. Osnos sees great possibilities ahead for Manchin. But unlike Chris Regan, he was caught by surprise when the news first broke about the Inflation Reduction Act.
I'd come to the view that actually he was no longer really open to something that was as substantial as what the Democratic Party was trying to get. And I think I'd come to believe that it was partly because his commitment to preserving the status quo, particularly around fossil fuels, was so substantial that it really was going to prevent the possibility of a climate deal. What I didn't realize, and what I think he realized, and more importantly even is what Chuck Schumer realized, was that there was actually a deal to be made there in which you would allow for two things to happen at once: tremendous investments in climate, in combating climate change, and at the same time, you would allow for the fossil fuel industry to continue on to some degree. You don't close the door tomorrow. You allow what's known in environmental circles as a fair transition. You figure out a way so that people whose livelihoods depend on that business, and Joe Manchin knows that very deeply, that there is something for them in the process. And I think that in its own way, the kind of strange magic of the conclusion of this deal is that it is actually the fusion of his own experience, his politics, and a way forward for the country that doesn't keep us trapped in an old-fashioned way of powering ourselves.
There are many who've criticized Joe Manchin's positions or failed to understand his tactics. Osnos points out that West Virginia's coal history creates political constraints which are extremely difficult to navigate.
What has been the great challenge for people who have been trying to understand Joe Manchin's room for politics is that he had to figure out, and ultimately the Democratic Party had to figure out, a way to talk about climate change that did not feel to people in West Virginia like it was a big boot in the face that said, not only are we going to continue to undermine what is already a really diminished piece of the economy, but almost also culturally and personally, we're going to go after this thing, which feels like it's more than just an industry. I mean, in order to understand Joe Manchin, I think, in his politics, you have to see that fossil fuels, and particularly coal, are actually larger than just economic facts in the life of West Virginia. They're a cultural identity. I mean, if you think identity is important to politics, then you have to understand why coal is important to West Virginia, because the truth is coal actually economically hasn't played the role that it did in a very long time. But it looms in the minds of people in West Virginia. It looms in the mind much larger than it does on the economic balance sheet. And for that reason, I think Joe Manchin was always constrained in how far he could go, how fast, in signing on to something that would feel as if it was a cultural insult more than a practical path forward for this economy.
Osnos says coal culture isn't just at the core of West Virginia's identity. He believes it's a key component of Joe Manchin's political identity.
I mean, the coal industry, whether you like it or hate it, has been pretty masterful at making folks in West Virginia feel as if it is an indispensable part of their lives, long past the point when it's actually been an indispensable part of their lives. In fact, any fair accounting would say that it has been delivering tremendous damage to people's public health and other things for a long time. but it is so braided into what it feels like to be a West Virginian and the pride of having been part of the economy that fueled the American post-war rise. I mean, you and I could recite the sort of, it's almost like the liturgy of pride in West Virginia about having been the engine room of American progress for so long. And that's really a part of Joe Manchin's, I'd say it's both a part of his psyche and perhaps even more importantly, part of his brand.
Plenty of West Virginia voters will tell you they support Joe Manchin because his primary concern is what's good for West Virginia. That means Manchin needs to find a way to move his state out of the past and into the future.
Manchin has benefited from the coal industry in a whole variety of ways, personally, politically, financially. This is not a scandalous description. This is a fact. It is also true that he, over the last few years, has come to recognize, as, for instance, the coal miners union has, that coal is dying rapidly and that there has to be some plan B for West Virginia. And that if he really does, as he says he does, hold the West Virginians' interest at heart, then that means coming up with a way for them to fit into a future in which coal is not a big part of it. And so part of what he had to do, and part of what the Democratic Party had to do, was figure out a way for him to do that in this new bill. And I think the surprise was that they were able to do that choreography because it was pretty difficult.
Beyond what's good for West Virginia, there's also the larger question of what's good for the planet. Many of Manchin's critics have loudly protested his previous opposition to climate change legislation. They claimed his position was a dangerous political gambit at odds with the accepted science.
When I was talking to Joe Manchin about this subject in the depths of the negotiations over what was then called the Build Back Better bill, he was already saying, I know that climate change is real and that we have to do something about it, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't close the door on people who have worked their whole lives to do what the country asked of them, which was to mine the coal that would keep the lights on in places like New York and Washington. I've talked to other folks, particularly environmental activists in West Virginia, who've had conversations with him over the years who have been like, we know that he knows that coal is dying. This is not a mystery. And so that actually made it even more infuriating to them when he would then risk this extremely fragile political moment when Democrats controlled both the White House and the houses of Congress, and that he was willing to run as close to the line of letting it fail as he did. That bothered people.
Joe Manchin's radical about-face on climate legislation also produced a radical transformation in his public image. And that may lead him to bigger things.
You would be hard-pressed to find an example in recent years of somebody who was able to transform his own image in the public as rapidly and as dramatically as Joe Manchin has been able to do. It's quite startling, actually. I mean, if you had talked to somebody in the spring of 2022 in the Democratic Party about Joe Manchin, they said, this guy is our biggest obstacle to making generational investments in things we care about. You talk to them at the end of August of 2022, and they say, without Joe Manchin, we would be nowhere. We'd be up the creek. And I think in a curious way, Joe Manchin is actually much closer to where the heart of the Democratic Party's political future is than the people who are out on the progressive frontier. But that's not an argument you're going to hear very often in the big city. And you know what? You want to know the best evidence of that? Best evidence of that is that in the 2020 election, out of 18 or plus options among the Democratic candidates running for president, the most conservative member of the field prevailed, Joe Biden. And it may blow some people's minds in the Democratic Party to imagine this, but Joe Manchin actually is probably the guy who is more like Joe Biden in the 2024 presidential prospects than anybody else I can name.
Do you think that the Inflation Reduction Act is the opening move to Manchin's 2024 campaign for presidency?
If it is, it was a masterstroke because it managed to hit these very different and very important pieces of this vast spectrum of American politics, because he managed to satisfy climate activists, and he managed to satisfy industrialists. He managed to satisfy conservatives who worry about inflation. This is like the triple axle of American politics, and nobody expected him to pull it off. I mean, I think, will he run? I think he probably will run, because why wouldn't you? I mean, at this stage, Joe Manchin has never been riding higher than he has in this moment in his career. I remember Barack Obama, when he was trying to decide whether to run for president, somebody told him at the time, you don't wait for your moment to get hotter. You take it. But it'll depend a lot on what Joe Biden decides to do. Not entirely, though. I think Joe Manchin would challenge Joe Biden in a primary.
Over his career, Joe Manchin's political positions have left him in an unusual set of circumstances. At one point, he was too conservative for the state Democratic Party to win a race for governor. But now, conservative West Virginians who see the senator as too progressive may help define his future.
The strange fact is, Joe Manchin might be unelectable in West Virginia next time around, but he might be electable in the United States, which is a curious set of facts. He's too far to the left for West Virginia. He's too far to the right for some of the Democratic Party, and that might put him actually in the sweet spot for the United States, because for a Democrat to win in 24, the primary task ahead for them is to persuade those elusive, coveted voters in the middle who no longer feel at home in the Republican Party and maybe don't feel at home in a left-leaning Democratic Party and are looking for somebody who is just a little bit of both. And they may find themselves almost surprising themselves with interest in somebody like Manchin.
The past 2 years have given Joe Manchin one other thing. As the deciding vote in the United States Senate, it's given him a sizable lead in one of the most precious of all political assets, name recognition.
Curiously enough, Joe Manchin, even though he drove a lot of Democrats crazy for a long time, managed to establish himself in the minds of Americans to a much higher degree than other Democratic candidates may have. And that is an incredibly valuable political asset for him. There are a lot of Democrats who never knew who he was, then they hated him, and then they watched him deliver their legislative promised land. And that's going to leave them in a really interesting position if he decides to put himself forward in a couple of years.
Despite everyone's frustrations with Joe Manchin, the simple fact is that he represents one of the most elusive and yet most important and powerful factions in American politics, the middle.
Neither side is going to have the luxury of getting the candidate that they think is the pure solution. It simply doesn't work in a multi-ethnic democracy in which we're divided 50-50 between parties and between really entrenched sense of different identities of what it means to be American. Joe Biden always talked about himself as a transitional president, which I don't think people always understood what he meant. Part of what he was saying was that the country can't go from one extreme to the other. You need somebody who kind of ushers it along. And there is this kind of dark matter in American politics, which is that most people are somewhere in the middle, and they exert this big gravitational force on our politics, but they don't do it loudly. They're not actually the ones who are out there every day on social media and on TV. So we get a slightly misleading portrait of what the country, we think it looks like a dumbbell with all these big weights at the end, but actually it's something more like a medicine ball and all the weights really in the middle. The question is, for Joe Manchin, I think, if Joe Manchin is going to appeal to Democrats on a national basis and reach out to them, he's going to have to figure out a way to talk to progressives that allows them to say, yes, we know we don't agree with you on everything, but you just delivered a momentous investment in climate change mitigation, and you've also undertaken things that no other Democrat's been able to achieve. And for that, we're willing to go along with you. And the choice, as they've already had to figure out how to manage, has been, how do you get enough out of this moment, this incredibly fractured moment in our politics, to make the progress that we can't afford not to have, even if it's not the full progress that we pursue.
And that may be the central element of Joe Manchin's politics. The idea that we all may not get everything, but each of us will get something.
The reality is that the fusion of us and them is going to be an imperfect marriage, an imperfect union. And it's going to be this process of coming to terms with that and saying, you know what? He doesn't have everything I like, but he's actually got enough of what I need and enough of what that other person needs that we just might be able to pull this off.
After all this, what do we really know about Joe Manchin? One thing we can say for sure is that Joe Manchin is one of us. And at the same time, Joe Manchin is one of them. So in this time of unprecedented political tension, is it possible that Joe Manchin could be the kind of figure to bind us and them together, to find common solutions? Could Joe Manchin be the ampersand? You've been listening to Us and Them. Please be sure to join us next month for our second episode focused on Senator Manchin. And Senator Manchin, if you're out there listening, please give us a call. We'd really like to speak with you. Our team for this episode is me, Trey Kay, Brad Stratton, and Kate Smith. Special thanks to Nicholas Lemon and Jelani Cobb at the Columbia School of Journalism. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, the Daywood Foundation, and the CRC Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. Senator Manchin, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.